Kenneth Stevenson is a filmmaker illustrating stories centered on bodily autonomy, the virtue of suffering, self-governance, diversity of thought, voluntaryism, and the struggle of displaced transcendentalists. He frequently draws inspiration from punk, the alternative rock music, and libertarianism to express his frustrations with centralized power and oppressive ideologies. During the previous 2 episodes, we reflected on issues in the film and advertising industries. During this episode, Kenneth opens up about the murder that happened on his street in Louisville, Kentucky, its effects on his immediate family, and the perspective gained from hearing the opinions of the neighbors and the police. Since then, he has replanted in southern Indiana with his family. We consider, what is urbanization's effect on freedom and safety in contrast with owning land? Can life be valued in conjunction with liberty? Is violence inevitable? Rooted in free will, liberty is beautiful and yet cursed with its price, eternal vigilance. Kenneth and I explore the nature of the liberty conscience, its effect on mental health, worries about loved ones' ideological capture, and discerning what are the real or biggest threats while entertaining conspiracy theories. We explore the nature of apocalyptic conspiracies, and for the sake of balance and reason, we agree that Americans owe it to each other to shoulder the burden of vigilance, so that there is headspace for one to live in the present moment. I'm Sienna Mae Heath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty.
Reflecting on your experience with family in these recent years, you had shared with me that someone was murdered in your neighborhood in Louisville, and there was a response from the police and the response from your neighbors, and of course your own and your children's. Share a little bit more about what happened and why it caused you to leave Louisville.
It certainly was a big reason that we recently left. And what was going on, we had dinner. It was I think it was a Thursday or Friday night. And, I was cleaning up after tucking my kids into sleep. They at the time lived, or they slept in rooms that were adjacent to the street. And I'm taking the trash out. At that time, it's about 11:30 p.m. And all of a sudden, you can imagine there's a fence with a hedge, and 200-300 feet away, there's another line of homes. And I hear pop, pop, pop. Oh my God, I'm going to die. Oh my God, I'm going to die. And it was a shrill, I thought it was a woman, but it was a man that was in such agony that he had just lost his ability to speak in a way that was, I don't even know how to. And so my immediate reaction was I ran in the house and said, please get the kids in the car. We're getting out of here. I don't know what's going on. But, at the time I thought, like, I want to protect my family. So we're going to get in the car and we're going to get out of here. And as we were pulling out, I think the thing that messed with me initially the most outside of the scream was looking down, and I didn't know where the shooter at large was. Like, I didn't know where he was, and wanting to help that person, but also knowing I got to get these kids out of here. Like, it was one of the worst feelings in the world. And coming back the next day, it was a Sunday because there was a church that was right across the street from this murder. And people are dressing up nice. They're going to mass as if nothing happened. And the blood's off the street. The caution tape's gone. There's no sign that human life has been lost. And it's happened within a period of 12 hours. And people are worshiping over here. It's not their fault. They didn't know. It's just, what bothered me was then trying to come back and act like nothing happened. And knocking on the doors, because eventually it really got to me. I knock on my neighbor's doors like, hey, did you know that this happened? Were you aware that right over here this happened? And one of the first responses I got was like, why are you concerned about this? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, did you know them? My children play in the yard right across the street from here. Like, does this happen often? And the thought was, very much, well, what do you expect? This is the reality we live in, like, here. And then I went to the police station and I was trying to get more information on, because at the time it's like, well, is anyone going to bring to light what happened? Because, like, what if the shooter comes back? What if like, what was the nature of this whole thing? And nobody was willing to give any answers. And it bothered me on a few levels. Like, one, this is a human life, regardless if I don't care if they're the scum of the earth. Like, nobody deserves to leave the earth in such like they're a piece of trash. It felt really upsetting to me. When I was in high school, we had this group called the St. Joseph of Arimathea Society. And the idea of that group was nobody leaves and comes into this world alone. So when we would find a body that wasn't being claimed, they would call this group, and then we would give them a proper burial at the potter's, with a potter's grave. It was this idea of, like, spiritually, like, let's not pretend that this is just flesh and then that's all that matters, this material thing. And so anyway, it just weighed heavily on me, and the response to it made me really angry. And I looked to my family trying to get, reassurance on the direction that Louisville was going. And all I just kept hearing was, well, Louisville's really not that bad. Well, it's really not as bad as whatever. And it's just like, I couldn't get anyone to acknowledge that there is a problem. It's getting worse. And if we're not willing to acknowledge the problem, we don't have any chance of fixing it. Particularly, I think it's a spiritual problem, but I also just started reflecting heavily on, like, where do I want my kids to grow up, and what do I want to be supporting with my tax dollars? And recently I've been thinking more about, like, maybe voting with your feet isn't such a bad thing. Like, maybe trying to send a message that isn't just through a ballot box, but like, no, if you're not going to listen to us, if you're not going to acknowledge that the crime is getting worse, the homelessness is getting worse, on and on and on, then I'm not going to keep subsidizing your pensions. How does that feel? Does that feel good? Do you get it now? Do you understand that this is serious? That long after you're gone, my kids have to pick up what you neglected to deal with. And so, yeah, there was some anger there, but then it also was just like, you know what, this is an opportunity. I started thinking more about my upbringing and what I think is lacking. And there's this thing that I'm calling, like, the autonomy index. So, like, I feel like autonomy and sovereignty is on the hierarchy of needs. It's right there with, under food, water, shelter, clothing, all that stuff. I think if you don't have the ability to think and do for yourself, you can't find meaning, and you start deteriorating, you start atrophying. And I wanted to give my kids this ability to be like, hey, go in the backyard with, your bare feet and go run in the grass, and let's get some chickens, and let's learn about the trees, and let's talk about nature and all of these things that predated this urbanization. And I just really feel like, for me, the currency that matters right now is how much autonomy I have and how much I can show my kids. When I hear people say, man, the good old days were when it was so much simpler, I'm like, okay, I think what you actually mean is when you had more sovereignty. That's what I think you mean. I think that you want more liberty, and you're too scared to give up the comforts that urbanization provides. So maybe it's not for everybody, but all I know is, so far, having moved to Floyd's Knobs, and we're still going to school, and we still have family we visit constantly in Louisville. And I still love a lot of parts of Louisville. It's just the management of it, and it's the vision of it. And if I could, I'd like to, like, share with you something I've been recently thinking about. Like, what do you think about this? Like when you hear about neoliberals and neocons, and they're talking about like regime change, where it's like, hey, if we can just throw all this taxpayer money at these regimes, these locations across the sea, we can make them in our own image. We can change them and mold them forcefully into another 1776 democracy. And of course, it never works, ever. It never seems to work out in that. And I mean, I'm interested too, because I know your family are they Iranian?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much proximity to Iraq, like you might have a different opinion on this, but I just see the same problem happening in our American cities here domestically. I see a phenomenon where it's like, hey, guess what? Feel free to sit back, give us your money, hold my beer, and watch as I remake this place something that you recognize. And I think it's failing across the board. I don't think any of these cities are something we necessarily are excited about or happy about or feel alive in. I know I'm generalizing. I mean, I think I saw on Instagram, you were in New York City or something yesterday. And there's beautiful things to behold, but in terms of, if you're 30 some odd trillion dollars in debt and you have no wars that you've won successfully, you have very little that you can point to in the way of city management that looks like something we can be proud of. It's just, maybe we need to try something different. And maybe it's not, maybe we need to rethink our assumptions on what the variables are that make a place free and worth westernizing, if that's the right term. I don't even know what I'm just saying that when the American Revolution happened, and I think we've forgotten so much of this, it was a people that was willing to sacrifice dearly to get the result that they did. It wasn't a war that was fought with drones or won for them or financed from another. I mean, you could argue that there were other actors financing, but it's just, it seems to me that we've cheapened the idea of what freedom and the price of it actually is. And that I'm not trying, I know that's painful because I'm not trying to disparage the people that have fought and died in recent wars. It's horrible. I'm not saying that. And I value what their desire may have actually been. It's just, I can't help but feel like the country and the spirit of 1776 that we are actually trying to get back to has been replaced with an empire. And, I'm a Star Wars lover and I see this sort of pattern everywhere. And to the original question of all this stuff from Louisville on, it's just, I want to disassociate with whatever people think is normal about that way of living and just clocking out and giving your taxpayer dollars and thinking that these social planners are going to fix everything, because it hasn't worked in my lifetime and I don't think it will. And I'm not willing to sacrifice my children's upbringing hoping that it will. So, sorry for the rant. It's just, I really think there's going to need to be a fundamental shift if this thing's going to make it. Because I don't know, every indication is that we're numbing ourselves to the preconditions of what liberty actually takes.
Some of what you're saying reminds me of themes in part one of our conversation. In the previous episode, we considered whether unity or centralization is inherent to human nature and to the natural world at large. And we considered that a form of that that's healthy and organic is voluntary interdependence, or it may be more relevant to America's tendency to intervene in other nations' problems. See if they actually desire our intervention in the first place. Are they asking us? I mean, I guess in some cases they do. But I think a common thread of liberty is like human desire and organic uprising, not this sort of like change the world mentality. We have to make the world a better place, which comes from good intentions, usually, at least in the microcosm of like individuals just like wanting to do the best that they can and do the right thing. But on the macrocosm of the US government and the military industrial complex's tendency to intervene, I think it's just a projection kind of, or like an avoidance of the efforts that we should be putting into our cities, and other areas of our country here at home.
Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts on cities in general? Do you feel that do you feel it matters, or do you feel like urbanization is a net detriment to liberty?
That's I think that's a little bit of a black and white way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But personally, I don't want to live in a big city, at least not in this country.
Yeah.
Which is another conversation. But I visited New York yesterday. I stayed the night before. It was a fun time. I ventured to a jazz club. I walked around Little Italy with a friend, and I thought, like, how cool that every night, including weeknights, there's just this like street festival going on, the kind of thing that only happens a handful of times a year in a smaller town or even a city. And I loved it, but not to the extent where I say, oh, I want to live here. I mean, one practical reason is the real estate is just astronomically high. And depending on the city, maybe it's more reasonable than others. But oftentimes the trade-off is the real estate might be lower, but then the crime is higher. It's like, do you want to take that risk? Personally, no. We're just very conditioned in the Western world to a more like materialist way of living. I can understand why. I mean, I think there's freedom in living life as a pedestrian for sure, and being free from the burden of owning your own car. That's just my opinion. If I could live my life walking everywhere I needed to go, I think I'd be very happy. I will not be living in an American city probably maybe for the rest of my life.
Yeah. I think COVID did it for me.
I think it really did for me too. My dream of moving to New York is dormant and perhaps dead.
It was wild. Did you ever get on the app Clubhouse?
I did. Yes. It was like having it was like having a party in my living room. Just like every night, it's just I mainly listened. I rarely said anything because I think I was just worried I was being recorded. Like, I know the premise was that it was live, and it just ended when it ended. But I don't know. It was cool, but I didn't last long on the app. How about you?
About the same. I think my experience that I found so interesting in relation to the cities was it was so fascinating to see citizens of cities across the world that were all speaking in some way as to how authority was messing up. And I was like, man, this is like a tremendous opportunity. Like, usually we're behind a keyboard and we can't see each other, but to see each other in that format, or to hear one another directly come up and conceptualize with a new sovereign declaration or something that would sort of just reaffirm, I don't know. I think there's a real opportunity out there for some of these Western democracies that failed so badly during COVID, for people to find common ground and to unite, to use your unity theme, and to come up with some literature that draws on documents from the past, but really is geared towards a new future. I know that I'm not suggesting a new world government or anything I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, like, I think, I was just recently looking, like, the Peace of Westphalia. Like, have you ever heard of that?
Mm-mm.
So during like the Protestant Catholic wars in Europe, back a long time ago, there was this like really consequential agreement that was struck that was like, you know what? We're not going to exactly ever see eye to eye. So you get this territory. We're going to get this territory. You run it the way you want to run it. We're going to run it the way we want to run it. And we're going to be sovereign entities that are going to respect one another's boundaries. And I think it had some really big ramifications that I guess I learned in high school, but didn't really quite remember. And I feel like NATO, the United Nations, like the WEF, like some of these superstructure things, I think that all of that might at some point need a reckoning with something similar. That's all I'm suggesting, that I really think we're going to continue removing our proximity to our rights the more we put into these superstructure things. Does that make sense?
It does. And when you use the word reckoning, I can't help but wonder, is violence inevitable? And when we call back to the 1776 spirit, we acknowledge that the watering, of the tree of liberty is apparently, done by the blood of tyrants. And does that origin story have to carry on into how we run our country and progress and revolutionize? Or are we kind of just destined to repeat the cycle? What do you think?
I wish I didn't feel this way currently, but I really don't see how violence at this point is avoidable. I just think that I would very much like it to be, but I feel like the ideologies at play are so winner take all that I don't know. I mean, when I think about like Christianity, it took hundreds of years to sort of subdue the worst tendencies of like the Inquisition and the witch hunts and the, all of these puritanical things that we did to one another. They were terrible, and it took a long time. And you can argue that there's still extremist versions of it out there, but when you look at wokeism right now and you look at, or whatever you want to call it, like there hasn't been as much time to curb its worst tendencies. And so for me, I feel like it is inevitable. I don't know from which direction it's going to come from, but I tend to think that anytime a new religion is formed, like there's some watering down that has to be done, because there are just fanatics that just go crazy, and they take it to the nth degree. In terms of the American Revolution, I guess I want to know, what do you think about that, though?
About what exactly?
Do you think that violence is inevitable?
Oh, currently, in this current climate, probably inevitable. Yes. Yeah. And I'll say, because tensions are on the rise, like not in a sort of theoretical or broad way of like, oh, it's just in the big cities, it's just, it's just a few people. No, I mean, between friends, between family members. I mean, if we can't get along on our day-to-day, then how on earth, are we to avoid violence? And how can we value life in conjunction with liberty?
Yeah. Well, I feel like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are intentionally ordered that way. I feel personally like liberty, I mean, the way those two things relate to one another, I don't know how much life is worth living without liberty. Like that was something I thought about during COVID. I was like, people were always talking about the new way forward, the new order, the great reset, and all these things of like, maybe it's not so bad to have to live in a way that considers everybody's air droplets all the time or whatever. And maybe that's just the caring thing to do. And I'm just like, gosh, that's what scares me about that is it really feels like, and I even think twice now about taking my kids to zoos, because every time I go to those gorilla exhibits and I see those gorillas and I look in their faces, and, one could argue, oh, but Kenny, they're being fed. They're getting free healthcare. They're getting shelter. They're everything's provided. Like they're doing really well. And it's like, we're clearly not defining, again, this is where that autonomy index thing comes in for me. Like, if on the hierarchy of needs you don't have autonomy, I think we need to recreate that hierarchy, because it's not complete. I mean, I just don't understand why life would be worth living if it's in sort of a glass box that has, all of your limits are set. You have no hope for advancement. You know that you're being spied on all the time. Like, why would you want to live in that place? I mean, and as far as like the value of life, like I mentioned, when the person had passed on my street, I don't think that liberty in and of itself is I've recently come to realize that's not enough. So like with my Christian background, I've recently reevaluated the story of Exodus with Moses going out of Egypt. And I've recently thought about, well, God didn't just, in that story, free the Israelites to go out and find Cana and just have a good time. No, he freed the people so that they would worship him, so that they would find purpose. They would find meaning. They would commit to something higher. And I really do think that that's the relationship between those two things. That I don't know if it was Adams that said it, that the Constitution is wholly inadequate for a non-religious people. Like, I think we need, maybe it's not through and through Christianity, because we have a diverse population at this point. That's impossible. And you don't want to, use force to do that. We have a beautiful way of life. But I do think at least the framers could acknowledge through deism that there was some force that was responsible for putting this together. And at least we should try and strive towards some ideal. That's my thought on it.
And the liberty that we can experience in the natural world, free from big cities. You've described, seeing your kids run amongst the trees in the backyard and your dog leaping in joy. It seems really simple, and like the increase in interest of growing your own food and flowers and becoming independent that way. That's actually prompted me to start my Food is Freedom series here on Free the People, because I just love doing that. But back to principles on liberty, kind of like in a more philosophical context, it has been said that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And that can really take a toll on one's mental health, like constantly having that liberty conscience. How are you seeing that vigilance affect relationships, perhaps amongst family and friends, and just overall mental health?
I think it is a really painful, it's a painful thing for me because, and I can't go into the specifics right now out of respect to privacy, but loved ones that have, it is very true. And I agree that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. But you got to realize, like, that is a curse. Like, you can have all of these great things. You can live free, but you have to be constantly on guard for the threats. So in other words, like, I have some friends right now that, I won't lie, they frustrate me sometimes because they have this sort of Eastern Buddhist mentality of they live in the present all the time. It's like, why can't you just live in the now? Just enjoy the precious present. And I want to, but being an American carries a specific responsibility. The rest of the free world depends on this place working, because if it doesn't, it's not going to exist very much longer anywhere else. And I'm not saying that we're perfect, because we're surely not. But it's so important. When I get in a cab, the first thing I love to do is talk to the individuals, many of whom happen to be immigrants when I visit Chicago or whatever. I said, like, hey, where are you from? Oh, great. Like, why'd you come here? Nobody sits there and tells me that they come to this country for amusement or relaxation or all of these commodities that we love so much. They're here because of that spirit that can be extinguished. And I think to what you're saying though, when you focus so intently on that vigilance and you're always looking for those sociopaths that are going to try to become tyrants, that can weigh on you, and it can create this neurosis, this weird psychological problem where you can't see the good in anything. I love this monologue in the new Star Wars series Andor. Have you seen it? Have you seen Andor?
No, I haven't.
There's this character who's so amazing. His name is Luthen Rael, I think, and he leads the resistance. This is the stuff that happens before A New Hope. So this is kind of the genesis of the rebellion, and it's really worth watching because, in my opinion, it's one of the best monologues written in Star Wars, and it has nothing to do with George Lucas or anything. It's amazing because this character, he's asked like, "Hey, like, what are you sacrificing? Like, what are you sacrificing for this rebellion?" And this guy's like, I'm in the shadow all the time. I'm constantly thinking about, what the next move is, who's going to come after me. I'm never going to see the fruits of my labor because I'm going to be extinguished by my enemies. It's this whole dark thing of like, there is a real price to be paid to being the watch guard. And so when I've seen family members or friends or whoever, close people around me that have continually been battered with infringements on their autonomy, it's not just a bodily thing, it's a mental thing. Like, it keeps a score. There's a mental score that's associated with when you have been infringed upon so much that you can't function, and you start seeing things everywhere. And I'll be honest, it's happened to me. I remember vividly, my son was born, and I came home, and in the mail, there's a social security card with his name on it. And I teared up, and I was like, why am I so frustrated? Why am I so angry? It's because this little baby doesn't even have the chance to establish who he is. And he's already been claimed by the state. He had no choice in this. He had no opinion on what this was. He's going to inherit all of this stuff in this social contract. And that's an enormous amount of responsibility. And I think that neurosis that can come about, I don't like to speak necessarily specifically about individuals all the time, but you look at someone like Alex Jones. This is a person that has predicted correctly a number of things, but he has also fallen prey to things that were not correct. And when I think about the mental toll that must take on him with family members, with friends, the lawsuits, all of these things, it's like, I really do believe that there was a version of that person that still exists, that he's doing it for reasons because he's scared. He's scared of what can happen. He's scared of these things that have happened many times in regimes before. And so I don't know. I think that we as Americans really do owe it to ourselves to help each other shoulder that burden. Like, it's not good enough anymore to say, well, there's really nothing wrong. You're just paranoid. You're just a conspiracy theorist. Like, you need to chill out. It's like, listen, like, why would I want to experience this mental anguish? Like, I'm seeing this, I'm experiencing this. Can we at least talk about it? And maybe 5 times out of 10, there's nothing there. But for the other 5 times where there is something there, you're letting a little sovereignty slip. And you may not care because you're fine being comforted and and whatnot. It doesn't bother you. But the fact is, like, that stuff slips away. And I think it does lead to the conspiracy mindset. Does that make sense? Like, that's my view on that curse.
I think what really causes mental duress is a lack of trust in our institutions, particularly our media. Understandably so. That's why we're here now on new media. And with that lack of trust, then comes a desire to find out the truth. And there is an objective truth, I believe. But in the meantime, on these independent investigations of truth, when one entertains a certain conspiracy theory, even if they don't fully believe it, it can kind of burrow in one's brain. And there's that question of like, well, what if it is true? And
Yeah.
how does that affect how you interact with people, certain people perhaps of different identities or belief systems. I think there's something just as intensely that happens whether you believe a conspiracy theory or you entertain it. And I don't know if there's any way of really escaping the conspiracy mindset if you are distrustful of the media. And the way conspiracies are affecting families and friends and even perhaps work relationships, I think is really something we need to draw more attention to. And it's, I think, more humanizing to draw attention to it when you also have been called a conspiracy theorist and you don't want to treat someone poorly for going on their own independent investigation. But at the same time, you might then be on the receiving end of being treated poorly or suddenly differently by a person who is, I guess you could say, maybe ideologically captured.
Yeah. I mean, I unfortunately don't know what it would take for for us to regain trust in our government at this point. It's something that I can't even fathom right now after seeing what we've seen. Now that we have the hindsight of all of these FOIA requests, we know what the government has done. And so when I talk to loved ones that are still, boomers that are using mainstream media, they're like, well, this is what CNN or Fox said. It's like, man, I feel sorry for you because I want you to see the other side of this and at least understand how much we've been lied to. And, that's not to say that the ideals of this country are gone. They're still here. But in this world order that's been built, wherein everybody's surveilling us all the time and all this stuff is going on, like there is very real reason to be concerned. And we need to acknowledge that those things have happened. Yeah, it's a very big issue. As far as friends and family are concerned, I just wanted to share with you that, on a personal level, if anyone out there is struggling with family that is succumbing to that duress, don't necessarily, there's a lot of conspiracies out there that are real. There are many that are real. Conspiracies are just the intersections of interest. When you go to a PTO meeting and parents share ideas, there's all kinds of conspiracies that happen every single day that they're not inherently bad. I've also heard, Sienna, recently, like people say, oh, there's no good time that an insurrection can happen. It's like, really?
That's a strong statement.
Are you serious right now? Like, I think Jan 6 shook us up so badly that a lot of us were like, yeah, that's never the way forward. Insurrection is never the way forward, or conspiracies are never the way forward. It's like, folks, stop celebrating July 4th. Stop, the Sons of Liberty, the framers meeting to draft the Declaration was a conspiracy. Like there's conspiracies that are good, that are honest and truthful. You should look to people like Edward Snowden as a hero, in my opinion. And there are going to be some instances, though, where there's conspiracies that are not so good. And I believe that there are psyops. I believe there are countries that are perpetuating duress within families right now that are trying to trick people into going down wormholes. I think of particular concern for me on the right now, because I hear it so much, and it wouldn't be honest for me not to admit it. Like the left has plenty of bad ideological conspiracies that are going on right now, but it's not like, I have to acknowledge that the Christian nationalistic right that believes, I think, Sienna, in revelation that's unfolding, like the charismatic Christians. Are you familiar with the term a cessationist?
Yes, I've actually been looking into that area of Christianity. Not for
Yeah.
myself, but of interest as to how it affects people.
I think that the subset of Christians that believe that miracles, but more so like unfolding prophetic truth, the fact that it ended when the last apostle passed away, I think that those folks have a much better chance of resisting the temptations of apocalyptic conspiracy. And what I mean is, you look at something like QAnon and the idea that every time a Q drop happens, I don't know if you know what a Q drop is, but when some ping or endorphin happens and you're like, a new bit of truth, and I need to look at it right now. And I think there's something particularly dangerous, at least something we should keep an eye on, for as to when religion and the idea of revelation and prophecy, we have too many people right now that are trying to act like prophets, that are saying, I know something super special that you don't know. And listen to me and I'll share it with you. I just think I particularly as a Christian, I don't think God is going to reveal to me what's going to happen from the dark recesses of the internet. I think that is something that is concerning, that could happen with any religion. And I did hear that, and it is frightening. It is frightening when you have people, Sienna, that say things like, well, it's already been planned. It's already been put forward that, for example, there's going to be mass public demonstrations of people being hung in the streets. It's like, where did you hear this? Or you're going to hear about Guantanamo Bay has been empty for years. It's all a lie. Or Afghanistan didn't actually happen. There is a concern to be had, I think, with conspiracies as they relate to prophetic vision. I think that's a thing. Yeah.
And with all these different perspectives, some of which are coming across prophetic, even if they're coming from a place of religious belief, we're descending into a form of new atheism, of relativity, of hedonism, even, where everything's a perspective. Meanwhile, we have religions such as Christianity, which at times are at odds with liberty. Like you had mentioned to me, Paul's New Testament letter regarding the obedience to authorities. Like where do you go? Do you go in the direction of everything's perspective and absolute relativity? And if you go and seek objective truth from a biblical text, for instance, and you see, well, that's contrary to my values and how I feel like I want to move through this world, and especially as an American, what do you do? And you as an individual, how have you struggled with Christianity and liberty, and what frustrates you about new atheism?
Well, what frustrates me about Christianity somewhat is what I just expressed with on that last comment, but more so than anything, I struggle with the idea of bearing your cross and enduring the worst of government, even when you know it's wrong. It seems to be a strong theme in Christianity of Christ submitting to the authorities, even though he knows they're wrong. There's specific passages in the New Testament from both Peter and Paul as they're being persecuted by the Romans and other authority figures, as they're being imprisoned and tortured and tormented. They'll say things such as, it is right and it's right in God's eyes to obey. The governments are put in place by God, and that to disengage with those is against the divine order. And so that rubs against me as an American that looks at the American Revolution and says, well, that didn't work there, so why would we? But the more I've been studying it, it's interesting too, because in the translations of the biblical text, there is a difference in obey and submit and how some of these things are being translated. And so what I've been told is that there's a difference in how the culture at the time viewed order, and not to confuse that with necessarily submission or obeying. That, you can show defiance and dissidence to authorities as long as you're willing to accept the consequences. That seems to be the proper Christian context of how to do that. And so I struggle with that. I had a friend recently. She was a great person. She just passed away, and she had a fight with cancer, and she really put me on my toes because she took me in during COVID. Nobody would really let me stay with them. It was on a film shoot, and she didn't care. She said, "Yeah, come on in." And we got to talking over a bourbon, and she was like, "Well, what are your thoughts on Christianity?" And I said, "Well, I want to live my life in such a way that no other Jesus would ever have to die by a mindless mob. Like, I think that's the way to live, is to try and build a world where there aren't authoritarians and bad faith actors and majoritarian mobs that do these sorts of things." And she said, "Oh no, I needed Jesus to die for me. I needed people to die for my sins. Jesus to die for my sins." And I didn't know what to say. I was like, whoa, like what? So if we could turn back time, and if we could interfere and say this mob is stupid and Pontius Pilate's wrong, you would still let that happen. And of course I didn't say it like that, but it just makes me aware that, again, liberty isn't in and of itself enough. You have to be willing to live for something on the other side of it. And I think for me, and when you're talking about principles, I don't think a relative society is one that can endure. I do think, and I know that people will get upset hearing this, but I do think that Christianity did serve and does serve as the immune system for a lot of bad things happening with tyranny. I think it's contributed to a lot of things, but I think if you look even at like something like the idea of subsidiarity that came from the Catholic Church, that was Pope Pius's response to his understanding of the dangers of centralization with socialism and the excesses of capitalism. He looked at both systems and said, you know what? The least problems that we're going to have is when we approximate power to the smallest entity and go out from there. So it's almost like the idea of the states in the United States, but it's like even deeper than that. It's like you can control yourself, and then you need to worry about your family, and then you need to worry about your street, and then you need to worry about your city, and then you need to, and it just goes on and on. Instead of this top-down approach, which has a one-size-fits-all that's never going to work and will lead to tyranny, which is what centralization does, I think Christianity has a big role to play in spreading that idea. And there's plenty of bad things it's done, but that's my struggle currently is, how much watering down of what I believe is necessary to join in unity in a liberty conscious world to make this thing work.
Interesting. I think maybe what your friend was getting at too is without the injustice, we don't get to see the fruits and in a way the benefits, of that sacrifice. And also, like, without the injustice, we don't see the contrast of, I guess, what you could call good and evil. And when we consider certain beliefs around the creation of the world, of the earth, at first we didn't have good and evil. We just knew what existed, and we only knew good from its contrast with evil, and we only now know justice from its contrast with injustice. And that's just, I guess, the world we live in, at least for now. And my cat back here agrees.
I think you're right. That's what she meant. But yeah, I think What I can tell you is that my life is better when I behave as if God exists. I do believe that. I do believe when I went and started building our company and got kind of caught up and swept away and not observing the spirituality that I had developed as a kid, my life got worse. And there's probably a lot of different reasons that could be used to explain that. But all I can say is the more that I've gravitated back to it to some extent, and I do believe that the more that I leave that door open, it's when I went away, I was kind of like deism makes the most sense. It makes sense that that something started this whole thing, a clockmaker, but I couldn't bring myself to look at God as like a genie that granted wishes. Like it just seemed so immature and so silly and not worth engaging in that way. And also, why would God allow so many terrible things to happen? It's just so brutal. And I think the part of my brain that likes to rationalize everything has to sort of submit in some way that there is beauty in the divine, and it is worth trying to have a relationship with it instead of trying to rationalize it all the time and trying to say, well, because it doesn't make absolute sense to me and because it won't reveal itself, it doesn't get my time. It doesn't get the time of day. Like I'm not a good person when I think that way. Mm. I suppose someone could say it's a cop out and a self-defense mechanism, but I really, that's what I'm doing right now.
Mm. Do you think faith is simply a choice? Yeah, I've heard some say that, kind of similar to what you said, that like their lives are better when they act as if God exists. And I've heard it taken to a place of like, it gives life more meaning if I act in a way as if God exists. And that for me borders on some selfishness instead of being in the spirit of service of God and just something greater principles and so forth. For me, I kind of resist the idea that faith in God is only a choice. Perhaps choice plays a role. But for me, it's more of an inner intuitive knowing and experience of God.
Yeah, that almost sounds like a Gnostic in some way.
Oh, really? What?
Well, just I used to study the Dead Sea Scrolls because I was very curious about why these books weren't included in the canon. And so there was all these Gnostic texts that were like very focused on Jesus supposedly sitting in circles with the disciples and saying, look, it's all within you, like this essence of, and which was deemed heretical by a lot of early Christians, and they were upset about it. But I don't know. I would like to explore that with you more. Like, do you feel, I have this discussion with some of my friends that adhere more to the Eastern spirituality of like, well, all that you need is within you. You wouldn't say necessarily that, right? Do you think there is something transcendent as well as within?
Yes, I agree. It's both. I take, or I experience God as sort of a Sufi, where you open yourself up as a vessel for God, and the transcendence can happen within you, but it's not that you hold it all within yourself. It's that you have the capacity to experience it if you achieve, what's been called, like in the Baha'i faith, the valley of nothingness. It's like an emptiness, as if you're like a ceramic vessel.
There is like an element of like experiencing the divine. We're hearing more and more people that are saying, man, I just took this substance and I went deep within and I experienced this profound thing. And it was there all along. I just needed to find it. And I'm just curious what your thoughts on that, because, I find that interesting, but I don't know if I necessarily like the thought of like God is like hidden in this like dimension that I need to unlock. Like, but it's interesting. What do you think?
Well, I've heard that like some people, when they're tripping, they access this realm of the little gnomes, with the little hammers. And I don't get the sense that God is there. Like, maybe that's real, but I just think that's kind of like a different area of I don't know, the afterlife, different dimension. Just for me, it's not like something I'm desperate to experience, but maybe I'll just never understand,
Yeah.
I think you can. Yeah, I guess maybe with substances you can open yourself up to something else, but I'm not so sure that that's God. Not that it's
I tend
evil.
to.
Yeah, not that it's
I
like
tend
evil.
to.
But yeah.
I tend to agree with you. Yeah. I just know there have been more mystical moments. Like, I'll share one with you real quick. I had very fond of dachshunds. I don't have a dachshund right now, but these little wiener dogs make me so happy for some reason. So this dog, we were in our apartment in Chicago, and my wife was pregnant with our son, and we were within days of delivering my son, and the dog slipped on a ramp and broke his back. And for those that are not aware, when a dachshund breaks his back, it's nearly a death sentence unless you can do like some IVDD treatments and all this sort of thing. But anyway, take him to the vet, and there's nothing that can be done for him. And I'm holding his face, and I'm looking straight in his eyes as he's passing away. And he, at the last moment, shifts his head and starts looking at me in a certain direction. And it was a very profound and very sad thing that I then, when we're in the delivery room delivering my son, I'm holding him on the same color backdrop wall, the same textured floor, I swear to you. And my son does the same movement the first time I hold him and I'm looking in his face. And I've never been a mystic. I've never been one to get so out there about stuff. But I was like, I felt something really deep there. I felt like there was something bigger and beyond that was, I know that sounds crazy, but that's what I felt. And there have been similar moments like that elsewhere that I feel the presence of what I can only describe as something divine that, anyway, that's something I've experienced.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah.
But yeah, and having kids and in this crazy time we live in is a whole other thing. I've realized you cannot apply libertarian principles to parenthood necessarily.
Oh, really? You got to enforce some authority.
It makes them anxious when they have too much choice. And I had to learn that, like, over time, of like, I wanted to really let my child have all of the choice in the world to determine whatever they wanted. And they couldn't deal with it. So that has been interesting when it comes to rearing children. I've almost out of necessity had to act as a conservative. In all my dealings with adults, I shift that mindset to the libertarian. So I don't know. It's definitely something that you watch other, friends and close loved ones with children too. And you just watch how they parent. And then you kind of recognize, oh, wow, that worked there, or that didn't work there. But more or less, even my most liberal friends tend to converge on the same things. So I don't know what to make of that.
That would actually be an interesting episode. We could focus on the experience of parenting as a libertarian, but in the context of family, I guess more so as like a conservative.
Understood. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for allowing me to talk. And no, we talked about a whole lot. And I'm sorry if I rambled at all, but it's been a pleasure. And thank you for all the work you do.
Of course. Thank you as well. And until next time. Oh, and where can people find you?
Right now, I'm in a bit of a transition. I'm still managing our marketing company in Chicago. But if you could go to my Instagram, the Kenneth Stevenson, and I'll be sort of releasing more information as to what I'm doing from there.